Welcome to the Book Gallery, a series of conversations with writers and scholars of imagination and erudition. I'm your host, Luke Sheahan, editor of the University Bookman. Founded by Russell Kirk, the University Bookman redeems the time by identifying and discussing books that diagnose the modern age and support a renewal of culture and the common good. Today, I am joined by Dr. Samuel Gregg, author of The Next American Economy, Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World. And we just got the recent announcement that it is a finalist for ISI's Conservative Book of the Year. Dr. Gregg is the Distinguished Fellow in Political Economy and Senior Research Faculty at the American Institute for Economic Research and an affiliate scholar at the Acton Institute, a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a Fellow of the Royal Economic Society, a Fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University, and a visiting scholar at the Heritage Foundation. He has a DPhil in Moral Philosophy and Political Economy from Oxford University and an MA in Political Philosophy from the University of Melbourne. He's the author of 16 books, including the one we will discuss today, in addition to over 400 articles and op-eds. Dr. Gregg, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Luke.
First, let's begin with some definitions. You say this book is about political economy. It's not about politics. It's not about economics. What is a political economy? Let's start there.
Traditionally, the phrase political economy has been used primarily in the sense of explaining this relationship between the social science we call economics, which emerged in its mature form with Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations towards the last quarter of the 18th century. But it also involves taking those ideas, those truths, if you like, that we can discern as a consequence of studying things like supply and demand, studying what happens when people operate in certain economic conditions, under certain constraints, taking certain assumptions about human nature into account, but then bringing that into a type of discussion and, I don't want to say dialogue, but an integration with concerns for what is right, what is just, what is the good life, etc. So that's very much what political economy is about on one level. Another way in which you can use the phrase political economy is to talk about the framing of policy questions, economic policy questions, in a context where you know that whatever the economic answer might be X, but you know you can't get to X because of the particular political conditions and different value assumptions and different senses of the good that exist within a given society. But nonetheless, you try and realize these types of policies. So it's different from economics in the sense that economics is a social science that will tell you about certain realities if you take certain things into account. But it goes beyond economics to take into account the fact that we're not just economic beings. We're social beings, we're political beings, we're moral beings. And that, in that sense, political economy takes us beyond the world of supply and demand, strictly speaking, but also is very attentive to the truths that supply and demand tell us.
All right. Now, let's talk about the impetus for your book. So if we go back to the fall of communism, free markets were... you could be mistaken for thinking that free markets had won decisively in the debates over state control of the economy and that sort of thing. But in recent years, free markets have fallen on hard times, rhetorically, I guess you could say. What happened? How did we get here?
Well, that's really the subject of the preface and the first chapter of my book. And it's a long and complicated story, so let me just try and simplify it. It's certainly true to say that with the fall of communism in 1989, there were many people who said, the economic debate is over. Free markets have won, socialism has lost. And you even had people like Francis Fukuyama who were trying to read an even bigger message into this, right? Which was, we've arrived at a type of end of history. Everyone's going to end up with liberal democracies and market economies. It's just a question of how fast we get there. But what's interesting about that is that it's very clear that that consensus of view did not win out because it wasn't matched up by facts. We also saw, as early as 1992, a good number of people on the right, the political right, not just on the left, but on the political right, arguing that free markets might be useful in some circumstances, but that things like free trade, things like economic liberalization had various social, political, and cultural effects which were undesirable. So a good example would be someone like Pat Buchanan, for example. So in 1992, he ran against President George H.W. Bush for the Republican nomination. And he didn't win, but he did a lot of damage to H.W. Bush, enough that I think it probably cost him the presidency in many respects. So there was already skepticism. And I think that that skepticism reflected a deeper tradition, a long tradition of skepticism about markets, which had always been there on the right, but had temporarily been suspended, and then it came back in force in 1992. So that was happening. Then if we go forward a little while, we also discover that I think the financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, did a lot of damage to the cause of free markets. Now, the narrative of the financial crisis was that this was a consequence of unregulated markets. This was a consequence of greed run amok. This was a consequence of the lack of regulation, et cetera. Now, I happen to think that that narrative is completely wrong and false, but it's a narrative that won. It's a narrative that dominated the analysis that went on after that. So that's another factor. Then, of course, we have the rise of China. And the logic, of course, had been that China's entry into the WTO, its wider embrace of economic liberalization, at least on the level of trade, would make China more like us. So there's this very common argument, which you saw people like Bill Clinton, but also George W. Bush, saying in the early 2000s that this is the way forward. It's a way of making China, pushing it in the direction of becoming more a freer society, because the argument was economic liberty, the more you increase that, it's more likely that other forms of liberty will emerge. But of course, that didn't happen. We know that didn't happen. And in fact, in 2012, President Xi, the newly elected secretary of the Communist Party, started taking China very much in the opposite direction, which tells us that economic liberalization didn't, Hegelian-like or Francis Fukuyama-like, necessarily lead to particular types of incomes, and there was nothing inevitable about these sorts of things. Then the last thing I'll say is, added on to that, you had the emergence of a type of populist conservatism, a type of economic nationalism, which I think had always been there beneath the surface, which fed off things like the financial crisis, which also fed off things like the failure of China to become just like us. And clearly there were a lot of people on the right, but also on the left, who had become disillusioned with markets, who did not think that economic liberalization had delivered on what it had promised. And then you have someone who comes along like Donald Trump, who had always been a skeptic about free trade. We know that. He was very vocal about that. And he certainly touched a nerve among a lot of conservatives, but also, by the way, some people on the left, some people, for example, who were supporters of Bernie Sanders, who had always been somewhat skeptical of economic globalization. So I think the rise of China, the financial crisis really created an opening for a breakdown of this free market consensus that had existed, at least for a period of time, on the conservative side of politics.
So you open up with placing this why free markets, as you just explained, had fallen on hard times in terms of the way they're perceptive, and it's this narrative that if they've been cast in as the villain in this narrative, they victimized the middle class and the working class. They didn't deliver on their promises in terms of liberalization in China and these sorts of things, and so. We've gotten advocacy not for socialism on the right, but for something you call state capitalism. What is state capitalism?
Well, state capitalism is a word that's used to describe anything ranging from the type of circumstances we see in China today to the type of heavily managed Keynesian arrangements that prevailed in much of the West to different degrees after the Second World War. So it describes a number of realities, but the way I try to describe it in the book is to say that state capitalism in this sense is not about the abolition of private property. It's not about the abolition of markets. It's not about the destruction of the price mechanism. What it's about is a certain confidence in the ability of state officials to use particular policy tools to manage the economy so that you get different outcomes from those that would otherwise be delivered by markets, particularly in certain sectors of the economy, whether it's manufacturing or agriculture, or sectors of the economy where it's perceived that markets are not delivering the outcomes that some people would consider to be desirable. So some of the tools that would be used for this would be things like the use of protectionism and tariffs, the use of industrial policy on a domestic level, which is very much about trying to deliver certain outcomes in particular economic sectors, but also the sense that you need to hand over significant policy levers and tools to experts, to technocrats, who are often quite non-political, but are very much convinced that you need certain people in charge so that what they would regard as the excesses of markets can be dealt with, and also that so that certain non-economic goals, important non-economic goals, are not somehow pushed out of the picture by the demands of market economies or market liberalization or the churn that goes along with markets. I mean, some might also say that state capitalism also involves the provision of a big welfare state. Others would argue that it involves things like substantive labor market protections, etc. So, as I said, it's not communism, it's not socialism. If you like, you might describe it as a type of Western European social democracy where markets are certainly not extinguished. In fact, most of the economy still remains in the private sector, but you have the state controlling anywhere between 40 to 50% of national GDP. And that's certainly not a free market when you think about it that way. So that's how I try and define state capitalism. And I think if you look at it that way, America is already far along that path and has been for quite some time. But what's different, I suppose, now is that you have some conservatives who are saying, well, that sort of is what we want.
And you argue that, well, this is nothing new, going back, not just to say the New Deal, but going back to the target of Adam Smith's great book, which is mercantilism. What is mercantilism and how does it bear resemblance to state capitalism today?
Well, mercantilism is less a series of explicit economic doctrines, because you can't really find many texts that say, this is a mercantilist economic system and this is what I'm proposing. What you find mercantilism to be is a series of economic practices regarding trade, regarding the domestic economy, and regarding the way that money and gold and the nature of wealth is perceived, that existed in Western Europe and really the European world, which of course includes considerable parts of the rest of the world outside Europe, really between, I suppose, the middle of the 16th century up until the beginning of the end of the 18th century. So it involves an idea that you can't really create wealth, you have to take wealth. So this explains why you have wars in the sense that states are trying to acquire territory because wealth is seen as a zero-sum game. You don't really create wealth, you take it from other people. It translates into things like colonialization because you realize there's lots of resources out there and you need to secure your control of these resources. It also involves the heavy use of what we would call tariffs and protectionism as a way of trying to favor certain types of industries and others. It's also a sense that exports mean wealth is going out of the country and imports is wealth coming into the country. So according to that logic, you try and limit exports and encourage imports. Now, as I said, it's not as if this is a sort of set of economic doctrines. The person who came the closest to explaining this in a doctrinal sense was Sir James Stewart, who was a contemporary of Adam Smith's, who wrote a book that appeared not much, well, I guess maybe 10 years before Smith's Wealth of Nations came out. And it really explicated these, what I've just described, these doctrines in a particular way. Now, when I talk about us living in neo-mercantilist times, I think it does reflect the idea that there are many people out there who have a zero-sum vision of the economy, that wealth is a question of being taken from other people rather than grown, that you need to protect yourself from competition particularly from foreign countries, is seen as generally not a good thing for a given country. It also means a willingness to use, as I mentioned, things like industrial policy, and you find sort of proto-industrial policies being used by governments in the 18th century. I suppose if you're looking for the exemplar of mercantilism in the 18th century, it would be the France of Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI. Very much with the state seen as the locus of economic activity. And let's not forget that Britain, in many respects, was a highly mercantilist society and economy in the 18th century. And Adam Smith's critique of mercantilism, I think, is less directed at the economic arrangements prevailing across the Channel and much more about the economic arrangements prevailing within Britain. And it also relied heavily upon close relationships between government ministers on the one hand and politically connected merchants and businessmen on the others, as they basically, merchants and businessmen would try and literally extract privileges from government ministers to be the only people who are allowed to trade in India or North America or Africa or whatever it happened to be. And that, I think, is very much reflected today in a type of, let's call it cronyism, that exists in all through the American economy today. And I often say cronyism is really a type of neo-mercantilist arrangement whereby you have certain merchants and certain politicians working together to nullify as much as they can competition and to make sure that their markets, quote unquote, are not disturbed from the outside.
And a big argument today for these neo-mercantilist policies is that they protect the middle and working classes. Why does that not work out?
Yes, that is the argument that's being used in many cases today to describe why, for example, many people are interested in some type of industrial policy. So I suppose a representative figure would be someone like Orrin Cass and American Compass, who very much articulated a pretty aggressive use of industrial policy because they're trying to engineer what they think are different outcomes than would otherwise be delivered by markets. They're very explicit about that. They say, we want to help blue-collar America. Blue-collar America has been hurt by globalization. Therefore, we need the state to intervene selectively in particular parts of the country and in particular industries to really protect them from further damage and perhaps to even bolster their situation so that things can get back more or less to the way that they were. So I don't think I'm caricaturing the position. I think that's pretty much what they are arguing for. And in many cases, they're also arguing for things like the use of tariffs, particularly when it comes to things like manufacturing. So what's my critique of that? Well, I have several critiques of that. One is, I think in many cases, they're advancing a relatively, frankly, economistic understanding of some of the social and cultural problems that clearly manifest themselves in some parts of America today. I happen to think that the breakdown of the family, the decline of organized religion, the sexual revolution of the 1960s, etc., I think those things have a lot more to do with social disintegration in significant parts of America than a lowering of tariffs since the 1940s. So that's one thing. So there's a cause and effect argument that that they're making, I think, about economics that I would dispute. The second thing I would say is that when it comes to explaining what's happened in particular parts of the American economy, I think their explanation is also faulty. So, for example, they will say that manufacturing has declined in terms of numbers of people employed in manufacturing as a consequence of open trade and trade liberalization. Well, I think there's a fair amount of evidence that suggests that that's not the case, that anywhere between 80 to 90% of the jobs that have declined in the manufacturing sphere have declined because of technology. And I'd also point out that when it comes to manufacturing, we're still among the leading manufacturers in the world, particularly when it comes to high-tech manufacturing. And that's a good thing because that's our comparative advantage. We do it better than anyone else in the world. So when I listen to the explanations of why certain things have happened to different parts of the economy that are offered by advocates of industrial policy or return to some type of broad protectionism, or at least specific protectionism for specific industries, I don't find the diagnosis particularly convincing. I also think that the proposed solutions would actually hurt the United States. So protectionism, for example, when you place tariffs upon another country, you need to remember that that produces extra costs for consumers in the United States. Another thing that tariffs do is that they encourage uncompetitive practices in the United States, because when you try to protect yourself from foreign competition, you tend to get lazy. You tend to think that, well, we just have to raise the tariff rather than become more competitive, become more entrepreneurial, make better use of technology, etc. And tariffs, I think, really lull you into a sense that you can pretend that the rest of the world is not out there working hard, trying to outcompete you. And when it comes to industrial policy, there's lots of arguments I would suggest that would say that it doesn't produce the results that it's purported to. It's very difficult to establish causality between particular industrial policies and results in particular parts of the economy. And industrial policy, like tariffs and protectionism, are breeding grounds for cronyism, because industrial policy and tariffs tend not to be decided upon a sort of objective, rational assessment of how an industry is going to be looking in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. Tariffs are generally determined, and industrial policies are generally determined by who has access to legislators, who can get close to legislators to engineer the type of industrial policies that will favor them rather than their domestic competitors. And if you look at examples like Solyndra, the famous Obama example of an industrial policy that went completely belly up, or if you look at, to use a conservative example, Foxconn in the state of Wisconsin, these failed. And they failed, as they almost always do, because they get very easily captured by special interests, interest groups, and politicians who, in many cases, are thinking about, how do I get reelected, rather than what is the best long-term economic policy for the country, let alone my region. So these are some of the critiques. And the last thing I'll say is this. There's also a fair amount of empirical evidence that those parts of America that we often describe as rust belts or manufacturing towns, most of those towns have now recovered. There's a fair amount of empirical evidence suggesting that they have turned themselves around. And those towns that continue to have significant problems are precisely the same towns that have relied upon government assistance to try and smooth their way through. So a classic example would be somewhere like Youngstown, Ohio. Government program after government program after industrial policy has not worked. So diagnosis, I think, is mistaken, and I think the proposed solutions either don't work or have a lot of negative externalities attached to them.
Now, some of the examples that have been used to bolster the argument for an industrial policy are Japan and China. So China making enormous economic gains. Japan, of course, being a economic powerhouse in the 80s. And I came of age just at the very tail end of that. So I remember as a child hearing about how Japan would overtake the United States. How do those examples not support an industrial policy?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Japan example, because I came of age at the same time. And I distinctly remember being told that Japan was going to take over the world. It was going to be the #1 economic power. I remember films like Black Rain that portrayed a world in which Japan was literally taking over parts of the American economy. Or Die Hard. Remember, Die Hard was set in the Nakatomi building, and there was a sort of undertone of worries about the expansion of Japanese corporations into America that formed a whole overtone. And there were a lot of books that were written at the time saying things like why Japan is the future, why America has to become like Japan. And this involved heavy advocacy of industrial policy, because there's no doubt that the Japanese economy, since really the mid-1950s, had been using a lot of industrial policy. There was even an entire ministry called the Ministry for, I think it was called the Ministry for Industry and Technology. And every future aspirant to the Japanese prime minister was expected to serve as a minister in this area, because this was seen as the mover and shaking of the Japanese economy. But just at that time, when everyone was saying Japan was going to dominate the world economically, within about 1991, 1992, Japan starts slipping into 20 years of stagnation. Now, there's lots of reasons for that. Its population decline has something to do with that, bad monetary policy, lots of asset bubbles. So there are specific issues. But it's very clear that the heavy use of industrial policy had resulted in massive misallocations of capital across the economy, many inefficiencies, had been a breeding ground for cronyism, particularly of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party. So much so that in 2002, the Japanese, let's call it the Industrial Policy Ministry, was shut down. And Japan's own Ministry of Finance said, industrial policy was not the cause of our success. It had actually been the cause of our failure. So Japan sort of publicly fessed up and said, this didn't work. It actually caused us a lot of problems. I would argue that China is going through a very similar process right now, because while China certainly liberalized to the extent that it opened itself up to trade, it allowed some private entrepreneurship, some private profit, some degree of private ownership domestically. It never became anything like what we would recognize as a relatively market economy. And since 2012, China has been going in the opposite direction, re-centralizing the economy, having the state run businesses, and deploying industrial policy on a massive scale throughout the economy. And I think it's pretty clear that it's not working. Now, I don't trust Japan's growth numbers, and I think fewer and fewer people do when people compare the growth numbers to the realities that we can see in Japan. But it's also clear that they're suffering from the same misallocations of capital. Corruption and cronyism is rife within China now. A very good example of industrial policy would be these cities that have been built in different parts of China, which have no one living in them. Right? So this is a classic example of industrial policy and some of the results that it produces. So when I started hearing some conservatives saying, and I guess in 2019, 2020, or even some Republican senators saying things like, we need an industrial policy Chinese style, I started to get very worried. In fact, that's one of the things that inspired me to write the book, because the evidence, to my mind, is very clear about where Japan and China, big countries with big economies like the United States, have deployed these policies to their cost. And it's not just an economic cost, it exacts an enormous political cost in terms of collusion and cronies. And we shouldn't be doing anything that encourages that beyond the already large amount of cronyism and collusion we already have in the American economy.
And you also point out that the industries in Japan that have thrived, so cars, consumer electronics, were precisely ones that were not the targets and the beneficiaries of these state industrial policy.
Yes, that's true. And in fact, those companies that went down the path of industrial policy in Japan Very few of them are around today. So it wasn't as if Japan, the industrial policy actually helped them. It actually helped drive them out of business in many respects. But it's an interesting parallel that we can make here between the example of Japan, where those companies that did not use industrial policy succeeded and continued to thrive, and those that didn't. It's a very similar story to the second half of the 19th century and the rise of American capitalism, because this was a period in which tariffs were used pretty extensively really during the Civil War and after the Civil War, and quite consciously used as a way of trying to spur forward different types of economic growth in different parts of the American economy. But as people like Douglas Irwin, I think perhaps the best trade economist in the United States today and one of the best trade historians, as well as the Harvard 19th century economist Frank Townsend, they both observed that those parts of the American economy that flourished in the 19th century, that flourished the most, were precisely those parts of the economy that were less subject to tariffs than others. Because I think tariffs generally encourage complacency. They encourage a mindset whereby you think you don't need to work as hard to innovate. And I think you end up becoming lazy. And so I see parallels between what happened in Japan and some of the things that happened in the second half of 19th century America, whether it's tariffs or industrial policy. So, I mean, but this is the important thing, because when I say, I mean, I'm against these things, I'm not saying these things because I'm some sort of Davos man globalist who goes to Switzerland every year and hangs out with Klaus Schwab. I think free markets are really important for America. And I think free marketers generally made a big mistake when in the early 2000s, they started attaching themselves to what I would call a type of globalist rhetoric and a globalist type of ideology, because that was a miserable way to try and sell the case for markets to Americans. Because when you're being told, well, you might be suffering, but this is helping people in Bolivia, that's not a convincing argument to a lot of Americans.
Yeah, so let's turn to your solution. So you say you're not rejecting America as a country or anything like that. You're not a globalist in the sense in which that term is usually used. But you believe that America is a creative nation, a competitive nation, and you have the term commercial republic, or also trading nation. Commercial republic is what we should be. So what is that? What is a commercial republic, and how does it kind of embody all these other things?
Well, the phrase commercial republic is a very old one. And if you'd used it at the end of the 18th century, in the first half of the 19th century, I think most Americans would have known what you're talking about. So a commercial republic is a society in which commerce, markets, trade, business is not just the dominant economic system as opposed to feudalism or what you might call mercantilism. It's an economic way of existing that permeates the way that people interact with each other and understand themselves, which is very different from how people understand themselves in a feudal society, let alone a militaristic society. And I think you can find intimations of this idea of a commercial society in the thought of someone like Montesquieu. So Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, for example, he really portrays Britain really as a type of commercial republic, even though, of course, it's a constitutional monarchy. But he says that what characterizes Britain is that commerce is central to everything that people do, and it's at the forefront of people's minds. Alexis de Tocqueville noticed this about the United States when he came to the United States in the 1830s. He said, everyone's an entrepreneur. Everyone's thinking about how they can advance themselves through trade, through commerce, through market exchanges, and through entrepreneurship. The Republican side of the commercial republic is the recognition that commerce is not enough in itself, that you need to have certain types of virtues, let's call them Republican virtues, or sets of non-commercial virtues if this commercial society is to grow and flourish and be able to replenish itself. If you want a good example of a type of advocacy of commercial society, the text that I would read, because this is very much an idea associated with, I think, some of the leading minds at the American founding, I'd suggest reading very carefully Washington's farewell address. The vision of America there is very much one, I think, of America as a commercial republic. Free enterprise is the norm. Washington talks about Americans trading domestically, but fearlessly abroad. He's quite skeptical of protectionism. He makes that clear in that particular address. But he also says that this society, this commercial society, has to be one in which, let's call them moderate enlightenment virtues, classical virtues, and religious virtues needed to play a role in forming and shaping the moral base and the moral texture of this particular commercial society. You can also find this vision of America expressed in parts of the Federalists, which make it very clear that the republic that is being thought of is not like the late Roman Republic, which is one, remember, the founders looked back to the classics and the Roman Republic a lot, but the founders also made it very clear that when they talked about a republic, they did not have in mind the type of militaristic arrangements of the late Roman Republic. They had in mind a commercial society whose wealth made it outward looking, but whose wealth also gave it the capacity, the strength, the sinews, the power to be able to defend itself and project itself throughout the world, very much as Britain did throughout the 19th century. So that's what I mean by a commercial republic. So as you can see, it's a little different from the way that free marketers were certainly talking in the 1980s and 1990s, because I think in many respects, a lot of my fellow free marketers were neglecting the necessity of coming up with a proper form of political economy so that markets would fit what America is meant to be.
And you argue that an important part of this, the free market or free trade argument won't always win. There could be some exceptions to it, national security exceptions. Could you talk a little bit more about how we would make those decisions and some of the dangers that we'd have to avoid as we sort through those issues?
Well, in chapter 7 of the book, which is the book about trade, which I've noticed a lot of people gravitate to because it's obviously very topical, I point out that free traders have always acknowledged that there is a national security exemption for the general disposition in favor of free trade. So we do not sell military technology to the Chinese. We don't sell nuclear technology to anyone, really. There's a recognition, as Adam Smith said, that he said defense trumps opulence. You can't have a market economy if you don't have a society. If you don't have secure borders, if you don't have sovereignty, you don't have these things that are essential for protecting a country from external aggression. So we have defense policy. Defense policy is very much a state thing. We don't hand over defense policy to the private sector because defense policy is about the nation. It's not about consumers, which is what the economy is ultimately about. So there's all sorts of that things that play very practically out of that. So generally, for example, you probably want to be able, if you're a country like America, you probably want to have your own defense industry. There are certain types of technology that you're probably not going to sell, or at least you're not going to sell or allow access to anyone but close allies. So there are a number of things that I think that fall very neatly under the national security exception. At the same time, we also need to be aware that the national security exception has been something that many American businesses have used as a way to try and get favors and privileges in parts of the economy that have absolutely nothing to do with national security. The most ridiculous example I can think of, which I know about, is an American fitness machine manufacturer that argued for subsidies and protection because you need fit Americans. And this was literally the argument they were running. You need fit Americans, therefore you need to have subsidies given to us because we will produce the equipment that makes and keeps Americans fit. That's a silly example, but it's a real example, and it exemplifies the type of cronyism that can very easily slip in under the national security exemption. And of course, the circumstances and some of the things that fit under the national security exception will change from time to time. A lot will depend upon what type of technology is most adept and suited for defense needs at a particular point in time. It also means that you may be willing to invest in certain forms of research and innovation that you wouldn't otherwise do, because we need to stay ahead of the Chinese or the Russians or whoever it is when it comes to certain forms of military technology. So, as I said, free traders acknowledge this. They've always acknowledged this. But we have to be very careful that national security doesn't become an excuse for everything to become a national security exemption. And I see that with some protectionists today. Everything is revolved back to, well, if we don't do this, there's always the possibility that we won't have enough of this particular product, which will make us vulnerable in the case of war or pandemic or whatever it happens to be. And the good news is that if you have a competitive economies can adapt pretty quickly to sudden changes in the environment that make you very wary about whether you should have supply chains in particular countries. What's been remarkable about the United States is how quickly, when the pandemic hit, how quickly so many American industries switched over from making all sorts of different things towards making masks, towards producing medical equipment and certain medicines. And they did it very quickly. And you can do that if you're kept nimble and competitive by being open to competition from not just domestically, but from abroad as well.
So you give some guidelines that would help us, and you've gone through some of these. Check and see if new regulations are creating barriers to entry for new firms, using the judicial branch to counter business and legislator collusion, shift competition law away from a regulatory focus, consider decentralizing the regulatory process, and then also the need for a broader sense of appropriate conduct. And I think this is my favorite one that you give, but a sense that Americans should develop a sense of contempt for those who seek state favors. So that you gave the example of the fitness company, and that Americans should develop a sense that that's inappropriate behavior. You should have a sense of honor of earning good profit, being competitive, but the reason you win is because you bring value to your customers. You use the term rent-seeking cronies as a good epithet for these people. Do you have any more you'd like to say about that? I thought it was an excellent point.
Well, yes, I let me just say this. I often say to people, I'm pro-market. I'm not pro-business. There's a big difference between the two, because markets are about serving consumers. They're not about serving business. And it's also important, I think, to remember that you don't assume that business executive, business leaders, it's a mistake to assume that they're all gun-ho free marketers. Believe you me, they're not. I would be surprised if 50% of American business leaders would say, oh yes, I'm unabashedly pro-market. They might say they are, but when it comes to the actual business of business, they're looking for favors. They're looking for regulatory arrangements that fit them, but not their competitors. They're looking for subsidies. They're looking for all sorts, particularly when they get to a certain level and they're concerned that they might start losing market share to new entrepreneurs and new competitors. So there's a lot you can do, as I've mentioned, and some you actually listed some of them. There's a lot you can do to basically make it so that businesses have to be competitive, and there's less opportunity for them to run to the government for favors, to run to the government for privileges, because that's what these things are. They are privileges. You're basically giving the government, giving subsidies or assets to people that it's not giving to other people on the basis that these people are politically connected and the other group of people are not. So that can help. The environment help because it shifts the incentives away from the government and much more back to consumers and being competitive. But I also think that it's very important for American businesses to say, no, we're not going to play the crony game. One, because it's not in our long-term self-interest, but also it's just generally bad for America. And you just have to look at those parts of America that have suffered significantly over the past 20 years, and you quickly realize that so many of them have fallen apart precisely because of this problem of cronyism, of being rent seekers. So I think it's very important for business people to be more confident about the rightness of what they're doing and why they're doing what they're doing in order to serve consumers, rather than letting themselves getting into what I think are ultimately very unhealthy relationships with politicians on both sides of the aisle, not to mention the massive apparatus of the administrative state and regulatory agencies to which so many of them gravitate over time, particularly when they become big enough. So it's one thing to say, yes, we need to shift the incentives. I think that's extremely important. But there's also a sense that American businesses need to say, we're just not going to play that game anymore.
Well, I'd like to see hashtag rent-seeking cronies trending on Twitter.
Well, think about it this way. No business leader wants to be called a crony.
That's right.
I've not met a single one who will say, oh, yes, I'm a proud rent seeker. So that tells you, at least some level, they know there's something problematic about this.
That's right. Sam, I'd like to open up and see if we have any questions from our audience today.
I see.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question if I could.
Yes.
Yeah, Dr. Gregg, you said earlier when we were talking about mercantilism, I think you said that the mercantilist idea was that you wanted to import things into the country and not to export things. I was always under the impression that mercantilism was about exporting and trying to limit imports to establish favorable trade.
Right. Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I actually mixed it up, and I apologize for that. And one of the reasons why exports were emphasized was that there was a sense that wealth was located in the possession of precious minerals, right? So this is where you find at this particular point in time, gold in particular is seen as the source. So that's where wealth lies. And wealth is not gold. Wealth is your capacity to satisfy your wants and needs. And so the wealthier you are, the more capacity you have to satisfy your wants and needs. And the mercantilist mistake was to say, no, wealth is all about how much gold or how much silver you possess, which is why countries were very reluctant to have gold going out of the country, because they thought that meant the country was becoming less wealthy. So I'm sorry, I actually mixed it up. You're quite right, but it's very important to understand this. The way that wealth was understood is very important for understanding the way that mercantilism and mercantilists saw the world.
Dr. Gregg, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
Well, I'd suggest that they go to the American Institute for Economic Research, its website, which is AIER.org. And everything you can find out about me is located there. And if you want to buy the book, just go straight to Amazon, The Next American Economy, Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World. I see that someone has their hand up, Consolato.
Yes, I'm with my son. One question is, you talked about the commercial republic, and that's a very interesting, because I study I'm a Roman history long time, and actually one important aspect that you raised was the concept about the economy at the time of the Roman Republic, of the Third Roman Republic. One important aspect that you probably didn't put in your book, and actually you should consider for the next one, and the influence of giving the land to the veterans when they came back. And this was one important aspect that many historians, they forgot. And actually it's very important because the veterans back and satisfied was one important aspect for the Republic to keep the Republic solid. Do you understand?
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
very important. It's very important. I try to understand why, and that actually when the veterans they did not receive the land anymore, you know, that was the problem. And then when the Civil War, and then they came out, then the aspect, and then obviously the economy went down, you know.
Yeah, so
sorry for
and this no, that's fine. That's it's a good point, because the people like Julius Caesar promised his veterans that they would receive large grants of land, which usually went along with slaves as well, if they served loyally and fought in the legions, and after 20 years they could retire and get land. But of course, by the time of that Julius Caesar was at his peak, they weren't giving out land anymore. The other thing you also see at this particular time is the professionalization of the Roman army as well. So it moves away from being a citizen soldier type of arrangement to the idea that no, that you actually have a type of professional military. And you also see at this time the Roman economy shifting away from highly agricultural arrangements towards what I would call an economy of plunder and slavery. And the two things tended to go together. And for those things to go together, you need a highly militarized society. And this is important because it was a contrast that was in the minds of America's founders when they were conceptualizing what type of republic they wanted. They did not, I mean, Hamilton, for example, was a little bit of a mercantilist, but he was very clear he did not have in mind the American Republic becoming one somewhat similar, albeit more technologically advanced, than the Roman Republic, precisely because it wasn't a commercial republic. It was much more of a militaristic type of operation. So that's important when it comes to understanding the Republican part of what it means to live in a commercial republic.
Yeah,
so
exactly. Thank you.
And Dr. Gregg, we have
one question in the queue.
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. Oh, my personal theory of the 2008 financial crisis. Well, well, as we know, the dominant narrative of the financial crisis was that there was insufficient regulation of the financial sector, that bankers and people working in finance got greedy, that all sorts of different financial products were put together that in the end no one could quite understand, and when you can't understand something, you're less inclined to invest in it, etc. Now, there's some truth to that. There's some truth to when you build very complicated financial instruments, and if you can't explain to clients what they mean, or if you structure them in such a way that you're actually hiding poorly performing assets, which was certainly going on. So there is that dimension to the 2008 financial crisis. But I think far more important was, first of all, the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates so low for so long after the dot-com bubble collapse in 2000, 2001. So you had a lot of easy money floating around in the economy, and a lot of it went into the financial sector, and a lot of it encouraged some pretty significant, and I would argue, untoward risk-taking. It's also important to keep in mind that the housing crisis was largely a government-engineered crisis, insofar as when you have the government encouraging, or even in fact, in some cases, effectively forcing banks to lend money to people who are high risk, who you would not normally lend money to buy a house, you should expect you're going to have significant problems in the housing industry. It's also the case that there are a lot of regulations in the financial sector, because it was far from being unregulated. The financial sector in America has always been significantly regulated. But there are a lot of regulations that encouraged perverse incentives and for people to engage in all sorts of practices that they probably wouldn't have otherwise engaged in if the regulatory framework had been, frankly, lighter. So I'm not discounting the role of greed. I'm not discounting a lot of bad decisions made by people working on Wall Street. But the role that government played in, let's call it inadvertently, engineering major aspects of the financial crisis has been skipped over, has been ignored in many circumstances. And that's a shame, because it means we're not going to get to a true understanding of what happens until more time has gone by. Because when you don't identify correctly the causes of an economic crisis or a financial crisis, you're very likely to store up future problems of a very similar nature. I should also add that thanks to the financial crisis, we got saddled with quantitative easing. A lot of quantitative easing, a lot of easy money being pushed into the economy in 2010, 11, 12, 13. And then, of course, during the pandemic. And that, I think, is one of the major reasons we have, well, the worst inflation rates since the early 1980s in America and the rest of the world.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to our sponsor, the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Please visit kirkcenter.org to learn more about the Kirk Center. You can support the Kirk Center and the work of the University Bookman through the Kirk Center website at kirkcenter.org/donate. Next time on the Book Gallery, we will discuss a new book about one of the intellectual titans of the 20th century, Christopher Dawson. I'll see you then.